Okay. Unlucky Children, Orphanhood as Identity. In 2020, the Queen's Gambit became Netflix's #1 show in 63 countries. Early on, the child protagonist, Elizabeth Harmon, future chess prodigy, is abandoned by her father, loses her mother, and gets sent to an orphanage. Very little works in streaming. It's amazing. There she learns chess from the custodian in the basement. It is the lowest rung on the ladder, leads eventually to fame and prosperity. I was watching it when I began to think about writing this essay. By the time I was putting thoughts on paper in the fall of 2021, Squid Game was Netflix's #1. In this dystopian drama, desperate, impoverished adults play children's games for a huge cash prize, and the twist is that the losers are executed. In one episode, the contestants Se-beok and Ji-young form a team of 2, supposing they will play together against the rest. In fact, they must play each other. One must die. The 2 women decide to exchange life stories and then to play one winner-takes-all game at the last second. Se-beok has a mother and a brother separated from each other. Her brother is in an orphanage and needs her to help him get out because their mother cannot reach him. Ji-young's mother and father are dead. She doesn't even know her full name. Ji-young, the orphan, sacrifices herself for Se-beok, so Se-beok has the chance to rescue her brother from the orphanage. Beth Harmon is the only orphan who wins the game. The genius for whom orphanhood is another form of adversity over which she triumphs. Ji-young is the orphan who loses, who meekly counts herself out. The first time I thought about orphans in any depth was during a childhood game of my own. I had to act as one. In a large hall, our team had to perform a famous story, silently and in a limited time for the others to guess. Our story was Oliver Twist. As the youngest by some way, I played Oliver. In the first of my 2 scenes, I held up my hands in a bowl shape and walked hesitantly across the stage, trying to look sad and afraid. I was imitating the scene from the hit musical Oliver, when in an unnerving combination of desperation and defiance, Oliver begs for more food. "Please, sir, I want some more." I must have been very young because my teammates seemed impressed that I could follow the basic instructions. As I silently asked for more food, someone watching called out, "Sweet." In the second scene, I had to run happily toward a teammate, a pretty older girl playing Oliver's aunt, another orphan, Rose Mei-lee, to denote the happy conclusion, the long, close embrace between the orphans. She held out her arms out wide, and I gingerly approached her, not reaching her before the time was up. The stakes of my game were lower than those played by Beth Harmon or Ji-young. Because Ji-young and I were dutifully playing the parts assigned to orphans, needy, hungry, desperate, with less of a place in the world. We both met appropriate ends. Oliver is restored to a family structure. Ji-young steps aside for someone else's. Even Beth Harmon can't make it alone. Her orphanage friend, Jolene, appears as a dea ex machina to pay for Beth's world-beating trip to Moscow. "We weren't orphans," says Jolene, "not as long as we had each other. I'm here because you need me to be here. That's what family does. The orphan dissolves or evaporates. Family remains." Alright, so we've got this sort of setup of there's a family structure that's more important than you if you do not have a family structure. So you're basically getting written off if you have no family. Okay, I mean, that's kind of what's yeah, I mean, fine. Oh, I guess I should more formally answer your question what's not going to work. I have a set of buttons that I have over here, and the way it's hooked up is a little complicated. I wish it was just like a button wire that plugs into the computer. It's not. It goes through the router. It's and so basically some of the more advanced things I could do pushing buttons isn't going to work, but the system says it will work in the background, so the bot will work. So if I type in like music, the music will pop back up, but I also have a button I could press to just get the link to push on music. Yeah, I know. This is like I've been streaming for a while now. I kind of a semi-complicated setup. So yeah, it's unnecessary stuff, but it is nice to have. Hey Valpo. So not being an orphan is a moral luck sort of thing. Is that the idea? Oh, hi Valpo. Yes, hi Valpo. I'm not sure. We're just getting into this. I'm not entirely sure where they're going, but it definitely looks like I'm here because, like, right here at this spot, it says I'm here because you need me to be here. That's what family does. So it looks like it's discounting the like rate of the existence of orphans. So when someone's an orphan, they sort of need to have more family, and so their orphanhood status is somehow discounted in media. So that's the question: is the media out, like, sort of writing out the orphan from history? So we'll see. There is no. I hope you're doing well, Valpo. By the way, thanks for stopping by. There is no official criterion for being an orphan, but I didn't know that when I decided I wasn't one. To be more precise, I decided that I was technically an orphan, just not a real one. Technically, I thought an orphan is a child whose parents are both dead. My mother had died when I was 6, my father had died shortly after I turned 17. If anyone under the age of 18 is a child, then, unlike my older brothers, I was an orphan for about a year. Nevertheless, in a brief conversation outside of our family home, I think it was the same week that Dad died, my brother and I quickly agreed that I was not an orphan. Uncle says, thanks, and likewise, tough few months, but I'm trying to get together over the summer. Yeah, I've had a very rough few months myself. We'll see how these things work out. Yeah, I wish you the best. Yeah, so my brother and I quickly agreed that I was not an orphan. We didn't give reasons, but mine boiled down, in essence, to 2 words: Oliver Twist. Orphans were children, not in the sense that they were under the age of the majority, but in the other younger sense, the sense in which at 17 people tell you that you are not a child anymore. Orphans like Oliver did not know their parents. I had been parented. Orphans were poor and needy, which I didn't consider myself to be. Orphans lived in orphanages where they were miserable. I lived at home with my brothers, one of whom, along with an aunt, took joint guardianship for the months until I turned 18. Orphans did not stand outside the homes they had grown up in, discussing whether or not they were orphans. As the decades passed, some of my reasoning seemed less secure. I had always thought that my putative orphan status was a private matter, a settled one. Strange to say, it had never occurred to me that other people might not come to the same conclusion. Ancient texts use orphan to mean a child without a father, fathers being what mattered most. This is why orphans are often paired with widows, their mothers, together with forming a metonym for those who are quintessentially weak, as one commentator put it. In modern everyday usage, it often means what I thought, a child with 2 dead parents. But in alternative usage, even in Dickens, is a child with at least 1 dead parent. His wife was to be made a widow and his daughter an orphan. This is how UNICEF defines it: a child under 18 years of age whose mother, father, or both parents have died from any cause. Recent social scientific research has tended to follow suit. Following UNICEF terminology, then, I may have been a maternal orphan when I was pretending to be Oliver Twist, a fact that lends the game a darker aspect. I became, UNICEF would say, a double orphan as a teenager, though older literature seems to use half orphan and full orphan for the same distinction. In wider usage, the term is even more liberally applied. I have seen Steve Jobs described as an orphan when, as far as I can tell, he was adopted, with both his biological and adoptive parents staying alive into his adulthood. Okay, so now we're making this a little bit more complicated. So, orphan, basically, back in the day, lineage mattered because basically you were only going somewhere in life if you had the right sort of parenthood. And so when you lost that, it was a big deal. And so even losing one was a major blow to your social standing in some sense. When you lost your dad, which was important for, at least in the West, for your social standing. So, okay, that's fine. That's how it's historically not meant the same thing. Okay. Even sticking to my own definition, it is increasingly clear that a 17-year-old is not just technically a child. I left London for Cambridge at 18 to begin my studies in philosophy. It marked, as I saw it, the end of childhood and my first step onto a level playing field. High school was over, we were all done being parented, and Dad had managed 95% of the job. Later, I would listen in amazement as older friends talked about how best to parent their 20 or 25-year-old sons and daughters. When they expressed concern about their adult children, I used at first to think it would be to be supportive to relieve them and correct their error. The second conversation I had about my orphan status was a decade after the first. I had started a new job and I was having a drink with some colleagues I hardly knew. I began with a question about my mother and unfolded initially in a familiar way. "Oh, so you were brought up by your father?" Then from one colleague a reaction I had never seen before. "Stop, I can't bear it." So I stopped. "The word orphan just flashed over you," she said later, partly by way of explanation. She was recently widowed with dependent children, and a great deal rested on her for the negligible chances of two parents dying on a child. Suddenly, there I was. I was still secure in my non-orphan status, but a seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time, I found myself explaining to someone that I wasn't a real orphan. Meanwhile, I began to imagine people dressing me up as Oliver, watching me walk across that room, holding out my hand to ask for more. I heard them calling out, "Sweet!" I wondered who else was seeing that word when they saw me and what it might mean to them if I did. Okay, so in some sense, when you're looking at it from the kid growing up, he's saying, he never saw himself as, set back. But from the parents' side, they don't want to leave their kids alone. And so all of a sudden, even leaving your kid, an older teen or almost a young adult, you might say, alone seems like a terrible thing from the parent, because the kid's really not, not a full human at that point anyway. Yes, in the semiotics, that's right. But there's still a lot of space left in this essay, so I don't know exactly where they're going. This is more, this is setting the stage still. We're a few pages into this essay. It's like 20-page essay. So breaking it down into essential definitions, yes, they are doing that, but this may just be a slight diversion into that sort of talk to get, to get more information on the table for whatever their real, goal in this essay is. Yeah, I think that's right. If your father abandons the family and then the mom dies, then he'd be an orphan. But again, I think this is all preparatory for wherever the essay is going. This person obviously knows how to write. They seem, this is well written. It's flowing, all this sort of stuff. So this is a technically skilled person here. And so the idea that it's just gonna be essential definitions, I think, is unlikely. Let me see if I can fix this stupid thing. Connect. Never happening. Okay. And if the absent father also died, he could be an orphan and not know it if the father is estranged. Yeah. I guess so. Again, this is the old definition of social standing, and like you'd be a bastard technically if you were like a fatherless person, but kind of like the distinction between bastard and orphan on the like a paternal orphan is kind of close here. Of all the orphans in literature, why did Oliver so take hold of our imagination? Why was I not an orphan because I was not him? If he were the only orphan available, you could understand it. But there were orphans of all shapes, sizes, intelligences, fortunes, and capacities, especially in the Victorian literature that my father encouraged me to read. Dickens alone left plenty to choose from. Besides Oliver and Rose, there was Orphan Pip and presumed Orphan Estella, and Orphan David Copperfield, with orphans Martha, Emily, and Clickett, better known merely as the Orfling. Game of Thrones. Yes. The Orfling. Presumed orphan Esther Summerson, befriending orphans Ada Clare and Richard Carstone, visiting the three little orphans at Bell Yard, little Johnny and our mutual friend, orphan Martin Chuzzlewit loves orphan Mary Graham. Orphan Sidney Carton was one of my favorites as a young reader. Carton loves presumed orphan Lucy Minette. He is a drunkard who redeems himself in death, doing that far, far better thing. His final gesture is to comfort an orphan seamstress who will be guillotined just before he is. She won't have to wait long in heaven, he tells her, before meeting her cousin, yes, her orphan cousin. Though extreme, Dickens was hardly alone. Jane Eyre, Heathcliff, Dorothy Brooke, Lucy Snow, Isabel Archer, Billy Budd, Becky Sharp, which Victorian characters aren't orphans. Within the suffocating confines of the Victorian novel, and reading them now, I often find myself reaching for the oximeter. This is without doubt an intimidating hit parade of varied, nuanced characters. What if Pip or Carton or Becky Sharp had been my quintessential orphan? Becky, a delightfully vicious social climber, will use anything, especially her orphan status, to get what she wants. In her acting game, she plays not Oliver Twist, but Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra. Don't know how to say that. Vanity Fair begins the day Becky finishes school. Among those orphans who appear as children, David Copperfield, Jane Eyre, and Pip all grow up. As adults, they make their own choices, usually to get married, sometimes unwisely. One reason Oliver stands out is because he stays young, in permanent dependence. Most of all, though, there's the institutional setting. Oliver is raised at a baby farm. That is, the parish pays a woman to raise him and other babies in his first years, though in fact she embezzles the money, letting many of them die. Perhaps I pictured Oliver as the orphan because he is born and grows up in the orphanage, the place where he asks for more. Alright, so this is sort of an institutional understanding of it at this point. Like, the person who is an orphan has sort of the institutional orphan experience in the orphanage and has like less than people with proper families. If so, it is a picture that needs updating. Children with dead parents have often been raised by family members, not in orphanages. In fact, there were no orphanages in England when I was orphaned. More to the point, the children who lived in orphanages were, and are, where they are so-called orphanages, generally not orphans. Clytemnestra. That's right, I've heard that before. I could not think of it. Clytemnestra. Thank you. Most had at least one living parent. Sometimes these parents were unknown, had given them away, abandoned them, or were unable to care for them. Most of these so-called orphans wouldn't know whether they fell under my definition or not, though the question certainly played on their minds, according to many testimonies, as imagining wealthy parents coming to take them away. Oliver's mother dies at the start of his story, but initially nothing is known of his father, who may be alive. Robert Blincoe, the orphan whose oral testimony was published in 1832 and who may have influenced the writing of Oliver Twist, could dimly recall someone saying his mother had died, but he could not confirm that claim. He thought that the woman who dropped him off at his institution was not his mother for the simple reason that he did not recall loving her. Orphanages, often enough, were homes for foundlings, found, unclaimed, abandoned, or unable to be claimed children, or waifs, a word originally used for any lost or unclaimed property before being transferred to property of a childish kind. Waifanages, if you will. Notice how you read my semiotic meaning without me explaining. #semiotics. Yes, #semiotics. Yeah, you run the stream sometimes. You know that semiotics. You just push. You're nudging me this way or that way, and I go because streamer brain. That's why I can't. You can't fight chat. You can never really fight chat. You can try, but it doesn't work. Waif. This is interesting about the old use of waif. I had no idea that this was where it came from. So any unclaimed property, but then it became a property of a childish kind. So that's interesting. But even that is a simplification. Many orphanages were in effect, you're not sorry at all, and this is not a democracy, this is fascism. Many orphanages were in effect residential child welfare institutions, supporting parents who were doing the best they could. Some orphanage children would have known perfectly well who their parents were because their parents had placed them there on a temporary basis, hoping to get them back. Thank you for the bits. In England in the later 19th century, many children in such institutions had been rescued, a term that encompassed everything from saving the lives of abuse victims, Valpo, Rescued, a term that encompassed everything from saving the lives of abuse victims to high-minded philanthropic kidnapping. In societies that treated poverty as akin to a crime, poor parents had less of a claim on their children simply because they were poor and a presumed bad influence. The same was true in New York at the turn of the century. The orphan trains that carried children out west to the families who had placed orders for them. Your agent has promised me... Well, we'll look at that in a sec. A nice redhead boy. I have a red-haired wife and 5 red-haired girls, and we want a boy to match. Likewise carried many rescued children whose biological mothers, according to the letters they left, might have done anything to retrieve them. Calling those children orphans was a euphemism, or at least a kind of studied fuzziness. Welfare institutions found it easier to promote themselves for looking after orphans than children whose parents wanted them back. When they did acknowledge parents, it was often to portray them as abusers, as the sort of people you should give us money to save their children from. Orphan could mean a child whose parents were, as far as the child's institution was concerned, better off dead. Alright, so this is interesting. What is this? Work-life balance, aerosol, acrylic, molding, glitter. Okay, this is interesting. I'm not entirely sure what this is about, but looks like an interesting painting. Yeah, so it's interesting. People were calling kids orphans because then they could sell them. You know, that sounds like the United States. In fact, though Oliver Twist and Robert Blincoe did not grow up in orphanages, or foundling hospitals at all, they grew up in workhouses. These were the 19th century employer of last resort, designed to be so gruesome that only the truly desperate would choose to remain there. To be at the workhouse was to acknowledge, at least tacitly, that one was the lowest of the low. The absurdity of this, when applied to babies, may be one reason why Oliver must be born there. Oliver is nicknamed Workhus, by Noah Claypole, the charity boy, so about as poor as it gets, who is delighted to find someone beneath him in the pecking order. Blincoe envied the foundling hospital children who enjoyed a higher status than he did. Oliver, the boy we consider the quintessential orphan, does not live in an orphanage and for a long time does not know the word orphan at all. Twist and Blincoe are campaign literature orphans from a chapter of British history. Both Dickens and the publisher of Blincoe's account were taking a stance on the treatment of poor English children. Workhouses saved money by getting rid of their charges, so Oliver is offered a chimney sweep and then to an undertaker, while Blincoe, rejected as a sweep, was duped into becoming a child laborer in a cotton mill. Well, employer of last resort, government job, government slave, basically. Yeah. To function effectively as a campaign orphan, Oliver is fit with certain specifications. He is pure, innocent, and moral, so jolly green, as the less naive Master Bates puts it. Although Oliver ages a little, he does not really change. He is not a Bildungsroman, a story of education and formation. His innocence, like that of Job, is guaranteed at the start, and it lasts until the end, because the moral of the tale is blunted if he has it coming in any way. Yeah, so I guess this is... Now we're getting somewhere. Because if you're going to go back to the story of Job, where it's a story of someone who does not deserve what he gets, just because God wants to see what would happen, or the devil wants to see what would happen if God does punishes someone that does not deserve it. And so a Job story, yeah, Master Bates, yes. You're very mature, cinesemiotics. It's hilarious, I know. So now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting into like these old stories. We get the story of Job, and what does it mean to actually criticize society? Because you are no longer criticizing God or the devil for torturing the people who don't deserve it. You're criticizing the government for having these workhouses. Yeah, these workhouses. So this is why it's a work of social commentary, that you have now transferred the work that the devil was doing and God was doing on Job into the government doing to these pure, undeserving orphans. When I acted as Oliver, I imagined him being defiant, but in the story he is merely being dutiful. A fellow workhouse boy has threatened violence on his mother if he doesn't get a second bowl of gruel. Oliver is chosen by lot to ask for it. He wouldn't have eaten the extra bowl himself. No wonder the other orphans cannot compete. Pip and Estella are callous or cruel. Becky Sharp is a piece of work. Carton is caustic, crafty, and disappointed. There is nothing in you to like, he says to himself. But he's wrong. It is Oliver Twist in whom, in the end, there is nothing to like. Orphan then brings two kinds of unlucky children huddling together under one umbrella term. First, the ones with dead parents. Second, by metaphorical extension, the ones typically with living parents who are nonetheless abandoned to the social elements. Yeah, see, this is it. So this is the abandonment to terrible social systems. And that's kind of the, I think, really where this author is going. Because, of course, there's the technical definition that the author was going for before with, like, you know, living parents who are none... So, no, I mean the non-living parents. The dead parents. Oh, I didn't know I could highlight this. I mean, there's the ones with dead parents, and then there's the ones who are abandoned to the social elements here. So, this is what's going on. And why is this important? I don't know exactly why. They didn't need to spend all this time making this distinction, but I expect there's a reason. Plenty of children belong to both groups, and Oliver unites them in a moral sainthood. But the difference must be respected. The first group, my group, points in the best case to what philosophers sometimes call natural evil. Catastrophes that befall us without human agency, and this is what Valpo was saying. This is moral luck. Like, befall us without human agency. So this is moral luck right here, where you're put into a bad spot. Our plight reminds you of your morality, your mortality, your helplessness in the face of those you love. My mother, I am told, used to say that all she wanted to do was be there for her children. I believe it, and she wasn't. It was nobody's fault. But the other group points to a different direction, toward the worst things humans have done to human children, which are surely among the worst things they have done to anyone, toward moral evil and the uneasy ways we have tried to address it. To speak of orphans in that way encodes an attitude, stuffy, moral, charitable, whether it aims to rescue these children from or by means of their institutions. Yeah, and so here we're going from befall without human agent. So no, this is social elements, and what it is institutional something or other. It looks like this is where we're going. We are able to draw distinctions like this, but out there in the world, lines blur, and we sometimes find it hard to maintain them. Signing up to Orphanhood implies a claim to a vision of moral purity, a useful fundraising tool for a plight that was not mine. If that were all it had to offer, I might have been well advised to walk away. Yeah, so he doesn't want to say he was abandoned to social elements. He does have dead parents, but he was not abandoned to social elements. Yet fiction offers another image of the orphan in stark contrast to Oliver Twist and his 19th century fellows. In place of the dependent maximally free, in place of the weak the strong, and in place of the cowering fear of the law, a lofty, vertiginous perch high above it. Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and Iron Man are all orphans. The death of the parents in these stories offers the storyteller a range of options. There is wealth, which Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark inherit, and which aids them in their adventures rather than marking them out for manipulation. Bruce Wayne receives the gift not only of means but of motive, swearing by the spirits of my parents to avenge their deaths, and so the Batman is born. Superman's biological parents send him to Earth, foreseeing their own apocalyptic destruction, but at least ensuring that their child survives. The year of Superman's first appearance, 1938, saw the first Kinder transport trains leaving from Germany, carrying many children whose parents had made the same choice. Superman fights orphan Lex Luthor, who has killed his own parents to trigger their life insurance policy. For the apparent orphan, Jessica Jones, as for Luke Skywalker, a dead parent, shows up to surprise us. Okay, so now we're really gone someplace different. We've gone into superhero land, which is, I mean, this was written in the last 2 years, this paper. So the superhero, like, huge media juggernaut is well in swing at this point. And they've been watching, the Bruce Wayne, the Batman movies, and all the other movies in the last few years. So this is another way to go. Yeah. So we're going to see where this goes. Like Oliver Twist, these are moral figures, but they are essentially active. It's hard to conceive of a superhero who does not suffer, but in the end, superheroes are objects not of charity, weakness, and pity, but of envy and fantasy. Ooh, my bot's still working. That's good. It was published last month. Aha. Yeah. So you can think about this in sort of the times it is in, where a lot of people lost parents to the pandemic. And so we're going to have like a generation of orphans, like pandemic orphans. And then you're going to be able to say, look, yes, they lost parents, but the kind of orphan they are, it was an institutional failure maybe of the government, how the government treated, healthcare, and that is really how they treated, people more like Oliver Twist than like, Batman. It wasn't like the government did a great thing and was able to support its people. Basically, medical care, you're kind of fucked in the United States. I mean, I don't know about the rest of the world, but here you can make more of a case that we are in the Oliver Twist setting than in like the superhero setting here. Okay. It is hard to conceive of a superhero who does not suffer, but in the end, superheroes are objects not of charity, weakness, and pity, but of envy and fantasy. I don't want to be Batman. He nuts. So I don't know about that. Superman, maybe. He seemed to have nice parents. Parents dress their children he had his first set of parents were nice, and his second set of parents were nice, so. Parents dress their children as superheroes, that is, as the orphans who are superheroes, and walk with them hand in hand to the kindergarten gates. Superheroes are typically American heroes, heroes of a nation that had prided itself in imagination, at least, on its own form of orphanhood. Colonists complaining about the British government had frequently likened themselves to children tyrannized by the parent across the ocean and therefore justified in breaking free. If one accepts the family metaphor, England, the mother country, George III, the authoritarian father, the colonies, the children, writes Eileen Simpson, psychologist and Orphan, it is a small step to the formulation that in throwing off the parental yoke, the children who had grown to adolescence had orphaned themselves. So we're more like Lex Luthor in that case. We find even more orphans with superpowers if we are willing to extend the definition beyond the comic book and the cape. Beth Harmon's chess wizardry, for example, the orphan hero I spent most of my time with as a child was James Bond. The closest thing to a British superhero, Bond is free in a sense, but with his license to kill, characteristically dependent on the motherland. Orphans always make the best recruits, M tells him. Yeah. And this is, what's it called? This gets brought up a lot in Bond too, so. Next to the Victorian novel, however, the second great warehouse of orphans. Just so you guys know, I've watched a lot of Bond. I haven't seen the recent Bond because people were saying how bad it was, but I'm going to watch it eventually. I've watched a lot of James Bond, so I know my Bond. Next to the Victorian novel, however, the second great warehouse of orphan stories is the children's book where the orphan appears enviable and free. There are good reasons for the wealth of fantastic, gutsy orphans in children's literature, Catherine Rundell wrote in The Guardian in 2014. She was about to name her top 10 while promoting her own book with an orphan protagonist. It was the first time I had read someone stating the facts so bluntly, giving reasons and examples from an author's point of view. Parents, with their concern for safety and the law, are a dampener on adventure. Orphans are allowed to make their own rules, fight their own battles. Without parents to protect you, enforce order, and inflict grown-up priorities on the storyline, orphans are free to run wild and live large and daring lives. Alright, and also when I was a kid, my favorite story was Pippi Longstocking. Now, she had a dad, but he was absent. So, like, she was just basically on her own the whole time. I love Pippi Longstocking and her modern counterpart, the girl with the dragon tattoo, which is basically almost explicitly a fucked up adult Pippi Longstocking story. And orphans are walking possibilities. You might turn out to be a lost prince, an Egyptian king, a wizard. Mowgli's parents are eaten by a tiger. Harry Potter witnesses the murder of his parents. Anne of Green snatched from her orphanage window by the BFG. Pippi is kind of like Batman, is she? She was a kid. She was sort of like righting the wrongs and stuff. But I don't quite remember. She didn't have like an alter ego though. She was just really strong and tough. That's why I liked her. She was like tougher than the other kids. Like she was kind of young. I don't think she was that Batman-like. And her dad was like a pirate or something. Anne of Green Gables is dispatched by mistake from an orphanage, while Sophie is snatched from her orphanage window by the BFG. Rundle's selection leaves plenty out. Frodo Baggins, Heidi, Pollyanna, Tarzan, Mary in the Secret Garden, Frozen's Elsa and Anna, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and the superheroes. The orphan is then also a stock character, a shorthand for freedom, adventure, and narrative possibility. Make the protagonist save a cat, and the audience knows to like her. Kill off her parents, and we know to expect a wild ride in the shared fantasy of a life without imposition from above. Parents can read their children stories of children who live without constraint of parents. Then they can tuck them up in bed. Valpo says, yeah, I think the dad is more like Alfred than a strictly parental figure. Pippi was definitely wealthy as well as a badass. Yeah, Pippi had a bag of gold. So, like, she was able to, like, pay people off that, like, you wouldn't expect a kid to be able to buy off. And so, like, it was sort of deus ex machina. Like, she could do stuff, but, like, it was always effective. But she was a badass. That's why I liked her. In a short essay titled, Why Do We Write About Orphans So Much?, the author Liz Moore reflected on why she was working at the time on a fourth novel featuring an actually or functionally parentless character. The orphan comes with a built-in problem, which leads to built-in conflict. Yeah, I mean, it is, I guess, a trope, you could say, like, at this point, where you have some parent, you get the lack of parent is a parent issue. And so instead of having daddy issues, you have lack of daddy issues. Far more than being an orphan had done, reading Rundell's description and recognizing this other kind of fictional orphanhood seemed to stir something up, to orient me differently towards the word. Even in its conventional sense, not being told what to do, the idea that I had more freedom, that parents were painlessly absent in some liberating way, had played a part in my youth. A fellow student, on hearing about my circumstances, said he thought having dead parents must be like having a free house all the time. One long house party, in other words, with no parents to tell you to clear up. It wasn't an empathic reaction, a little like telling someone whose roof has been blown off that you've always dreamed of sleeping under the stars, but it was part of the story. I was freer than average in my orphan year. I had guardians with the same legal authority as a parent, but one of them did not live at home and the other was my brother, then in his early 20s. Neither was in the habit of laying down the law. Money and freedom it brings was a more complex affair. At first, I wanted to reassure people that I wasn't in need of charity, I wasn't an Oliver Twist. Of course, not everyone was merely reassured. It is disconcerting to be envied for something, the direct and necessary cause of which is your greatest personal tragedy. Call it rich orphan problems. Yeah, so this was like first world orphan problems. You've got like a nice family and you're not starving. It's a different situation than the Oliver Twist case. Now this is a flex. After I finished my first degree, I kept on studying philosophy. My PhD dissertation was about different concepts of freedom, a word very often deployed when we talk about something we like. It is hardly surprising then that the history of philosophy can provide a counter-image of freedom to that of the free orphan. In sum, family is freedom. It's not all there is to freedom, but it would be difficult, if not impossible, to have freedom without it. Writing in 1821 between the real birth of Blinko and the fictional birth of Twist, Hegel is perfectly aware that family life is a kind of restriction and one you might well dream of being without. Each member of a couple, for example, faces individual self-limitation, but such limitation is in fact their liberation. Yeah, so I mean, we can bring in like the old Gauguin example that we were talking about in the last few weeks. Like, he had a family and stuff, and he just ditched them to go be a painter in Southeast Asia. Because he was like, you know what, I'm going to be a great painter. I'm just leaving. But like, you know, that screwed over his wife and kid. That was their freedom, like that he was there making money and being there. That was his wife and kid's freedom. And then he basically made an orphan so that he could be a famous painter. And so that's, yeah, and that in the 1800s is basically Gauguin's freedom became like his child's orphanage. The kind of liberation he has in mind begins with his understanding of love. To love someone is to renounce a naive claim to independent existence, a pardonable but unrealistic fantasy of freedom, like the flying above Metropolis faster than a speeding bullet. Since we do, in fact, need each other, since we are not superheroes, simple-minded attempts at complete personal independence in Hegel's eyes led to disastrous unfreedom. Children receive this lesson implicitly in the family, where what they need to survive is provided without question. But their freedom is secured in other ways too. They are disciplined, which brings freedom because this is the 19th century. Unconstrained natural desires and inclinations keep people in bondage, slave to their passions. They are educated, brought up, and supported, which brings freedom because it gives them what they need to stand on their own. Another way of saying this is that family gives children Bildung, the very thing Oliver Twist does not require. Children in a family are taken seriously and cared for in their own idiosyncrasy. In warmer prose, they are special. Orphans, well, I guess you could say they're special, but they're people like their own kids, so they're special to their parents. So, they're preferred. Orphans who appear special, even magical to the non-orphan child, reading stories about them often complain precisely of not feeling special, of being nobody's little boy or girl, of being emotional waifs, unclaimed. This specialness is freedom because within limits, a free person must find value in fulfilling their own desires and pursuing their own personal projects, which only family life can easily accommodate and nourish. Hegel has sharp words for anyone who idealizes a child beyond the reach of society. No one should imagine that the breath of the spiritual world will not eventually find its way into this solitude. Viewed from this perspective, being on the outside is unfreedom. The world will come for you. You just won't be ready. People who aren't ready aren't free. I'm not sure I buy Hegel's account, but it makes sense. You need to have, some structure. You need money and you need social standing in society to get anything done. If you don't have that, you're basically a bum on the street. You may have some freedom, but it's limited. A bum on the street has more trouble walking into a bank and getting a loan. You can do it, but it's harder. And so there's a lot of things in society you're not going to be able to get if you don't have certain structures. Like, you can try to get a loan, but say you don't have a credit rating. What are you going to do? I had to go get a credit rating a few years ago. It's like, I didn't care. I only spent money I had. I never needed a credit card. But if you want to look good in the eyes of a bank, you need a credit card. So I was free in the sense that I had money and I could do what I wanted with it, but I couldn't walk into a bank because I didn't have that stupid number. And do I want to have a credit card? Not really. I don't care. I spend the money I have, not money I don't have. So, whatever. But this is the thing. You have to play the sort of the society game to get the freedoms that society provides. I trust my reader to recognize that it is only human for a former technical orphan encountering the traits of orphan children's stories to reflect on their relation to his life, which has not been one long adventure, large, wild, and daring. I am not a lost prince. There is little mystery associated with my childhood and my origins. I know exactly who my mother was. I know she is dead because I saw the white lips on her corpse. I still could imagine such a reader replying with due tact that these stories are not really for orphan readers and that their deepest subject is not orphanhood. They explore through the device, another nice picture here, of absent parents, a world of possibility, the dream of every child to go it alone, abetted by the inability of every child to think through the real-world implications. Doubtless, some have a darker side too. Even if it remains beneath the surface, orphan stories tap into universal fears of loss and vulnerability, what it might mean to have everything taken away from you, and to meet yourself on the other side. The orphan condition is not essentially the objective state of growing up without one's real parents, writes Baruch Hochman and Ilya Wachs in an academic study on orphans in Dickens. Loss is a primary condition of human life. Orphanhood is the ultimate reach of our ineluctable sense of loss. Orphans, it's not about you, it's about everyone. But the deeper reaction I had to Rundell's words applies exactly there. It had less to do with any dissonance between the content of these stories in my life to the accuracies or inaccuracies of orphanhood as freedom or even as universal loss. When I read that orphans are free to run wild and live large and daring lives, I felt certain, as certain as one can feel without knowing, that Rundell would be amazed if someone told her that a real former orphan was reading her words and that he was judging her. Moore, who notes that there are real orphans out there and asks whether this problem is even mine to write about, leaves me with a similar unease. I'm losing my words. It is the unease of being glossed over a little too smoothly. We, as I newly began to imagine, were being spoken over for the benefit of others, whether merely for entertainment or for therapeutic non-orphan self-exploration. We just aren't the kind of people who usually say anything at all, at least not as orphans. You wouldn't dare write that, I thought, reading Rundell about another. But about another what, exactly? And for what it's worth, the best I could come up with was about another social identity. What I felt was the desire to speak for us as us. Yeah, so we're getting back to the social here. This is what I think is where I think the author is hitting, is the social status of orphans as sort of a well, I think the title was as identity, of course. Orphan is identity, but it's the social use of orphans in society as an idea, not as like in the workhouse in Oliver Twist. A recent study of American orphans claims that 1 in 1,000 children are double orphans. It concludes that a single and double orphans typically have worse education and health outcomes. In her analysis of 50 orphan folk tales from around the world, Melanie Kimball writes that orphans are clearly marked as being different from the rest of society. They are the eternal other. It is hardly surprising then that I have come to think of orphanhood through the lens of social identity. Hasn't identity become one of our principal ways of exploring otherness and putative disadvantage? And so I find myself wondering, on reading Rundell's lines, what an equivalent piece would look like that lightheartedly examined the best children's stories featuring a gutsy wheelchair user or the walking possibilities of the racially as opposed to the eternally other. These comparisons, whatever their objective aptness, have had something to offer me. Perhaps they will offer you, non-orphan reader, another way to understand me, to identify me. If you have had identities to manage, hear stories about, chafe against, deny, or reveal. It isn't a perfect fit. A social identity, claims the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, requires, among other things, a label. He gives this generic letter L and a way to apply the label. He also says that the tendency to think of yourself as this kind of person, as falling within this category, should make a difference to how you behave. Now, it's clear from Appiah's examples that he is thinking of identities that are either visible. Putative disadvantage sounds catty. Yeah, a little bit. You know, this person's a philosopher. You have to give them a little bit of leeway on their language. Now, it's clear from Appiah's examples that he's thinking of identities that are either visible or publicly accessible and widely known. For this to apply, it needn't be that every member of the group is readily identifiable as such, which is rarely, if ever, the case, but only that plenty of them are. One example of changed behavior is that you respond with pride as an L when L triumphs, or that you might be found restraining your public conduct by the thought that misbehavior will reflect badly on L's. In folktales, orphans may be clearly marked as being different. In real life, we are not marked out, which is one reason why I've never taken pride in the achievements of another orphan, or worried that my actions will confirm the most harmful or irritating orphan stereotypes. We lack something else too, a sense of what we might share, a ritual, a gathering place, or just some structured, plausible account of what it is like, not just for me, but for us. And without some of those things, it would seem absurd to claim an affinity with Aristotle, Bach, Wordsworth, Keats, Tolstoy, Bertrand Russell, or Marilyn Monroe. If orphanhood is a social identity, it has failed for me to meet Appiah's criterion, where thinking of yourself as this kind of person changes the way you behave. At least it has failed for me until now. The author, Valpo says, the author is also a Brit. I think that might affect language too. Yeah, there might be something, there like a few shifts here that like I'm not getting, because it is a little off between American English and actual English. British English. Yeah, New York English is the only proper English. I'm trying to think, like, what the question. Some of this stuff is, of course, you don't have to identify as something, to feel, someone else's struggle. You can take on as your own, or you can empathize with someone else's struggle. So you could say, well, if I were this sort of person, and empathize with them, like, I'm not black, I could empathize with the black struggle, to whatever degree. But like, yeah, but the fact that, like, the idea that there's a social identity that you have to recognize, I see the author's point here that, just taking it on there's more to it than that, because in some sense you have to have felt it over time, and there's a history there, and so that's why the author says at least it has failed for me until now. This is something that happens in time, being part of a social group. Early on in my year as a technical orphan, a friend asked me for a favor. One of his friends, I'll call her Megan, had lost her father and her mother was dying. Would I talk to her? I didn't think I had much to say, but yes, of course, if she wanted to. Another of Appia's examples of changed behavior includes offering a helping hand to another L, perhaps who is otherwise a stranger. I hoped I might be able to offer something to Megan, but I was also thinking of myself and what help I might require. I had never met another technical orphan. What did I want from a fellow orphan? Not instant friendship or closeness. Rather, it was something like navigational assistance in a world that simply did not expect me to be what I was. Long before I realized that superheroes were orphans, there was one way in which I identified with them, which had nothing to do with freedom or adventure. Superheroes have something to tell, a secret that changes how people think of them. If you don't tell, you aren't being truthful, not just about one isolated fact, but about how you think of yourself as a whole. As an older child and a young adult, parents were the subject of incessant small talk. I could tell you so much about my friends' mothers and fathers, even those I never met. How could I enter such conversations honestly without annihilating them? At times I thought of telling the truth, for lack of a better phrase, as a form of coming out, another borrowing from the language of identity. At other times it seemed like a superpower. Yeah, I don't tell people I'm a philosopher. They're going to start asking weird questions. Like, you don't want to be like, I'm part of that philosophy group. Like, most of the time I never mention that I do any philosophy because, this is fair. You don't want to get these like weird questions, and you're going to blow up conversations. Like, if you start saying, oh yeah, well, your logic is just terrible. Generally their logic isn't terrible, or at least if it is terrible, I know what they should have been saying. But yeah, I do think of myself as an asshole mostly, but I'm always trying to not be. But yeah, so it's like this does happen. This sort of, I try not to blow up conversations unnecessarily with. You don't bring it's like you're bringing a bazooka to a knife fight. It's like everyone was having a good time at the knife fight, but then you pulled out your bazooka. So bringing a gun to a fist fight or something. Okay, of course it was not the kind of superpower that the mature superhero has under their control. It was the clumsy kind that the young hero doesn't know how to use, and reactions to the telling were outsized and unpredictable. Some teachers took extraordinary pains to help me out, others seemed, if anything, to be harsher. It opened doors. Kids who had seemed hostile suddenly asked how I was, sought reconciliation, invited me to exclusive parties. Only, not all of them. Not all at once, and not whenever I chose. We philosophers are Jedi Knights. Yeah, I don't know about that. If I had like mind tricks, I'd feel a lot better. That'd be about it. When I got to those parties, I did not know if the person I told would try to kiss me or announce to the room that I was so fucking depressing. A neighboring boy offered to buy me a night with a prostitute. Hey, that was nice of him. Once dejected, I stuttered something to a girl I half knew about what was happening at home. Averting her gaze and remaining completely silent, she took my hand, led me back to where my friends were, and then walked away. It was at once tender and utterly humiliating. I have avoided her ever since. My ex-girlfriend told me I was being melodramatic about the whole thing, that is, about the then imminent death of my one remaining parent while I was still a child. But we were all children, and she was right, at least in the sense that I was trying and failing to use my new superpower to stay in her life. Philosophy is mind tricks. Well, as you were asking before, Cinesemiotics, how do you get people to think things? Well, you tell them stuff, and then certain things follow from that stuff, and then that's what happens. You will be thinking things because I said stuff, and I knew what I was saying, and I knew where it would lead. So if you want to know the mind tricks, you can go study logic, because you will end up thinking things that I put enough ideas in your head. Then eventually you will think, and you will go where I want you to. You will think what I want you to think. So there you go. Study more logic. I mean, this is just what people do in school. They're trying to teach you to think by putting ideas in your head and getting you to arrive at certain conclusions. It's not actually that uncommon. And you could think about this also in terms of mythology and religion and all those sorts of stories. What are they actually trying to get you to do? So yeah. And propaganda, for that matter. The worst reaction was avoidance, even revulsion. Jack and Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest receives both the most succulent reply when it emerges that he has lost his parents. Both? That seems like carelessness. Wilde aside, a surprisingly common response was to joke that I must have killed them. It speaks to something icky or unnerving about us. Orphan and The Orphanage are both horror films. You can pay to go ghost hunting at a former orphanage in Liverpool. At the start of his book, part history, part collection of orphan testimonies, Jeremy Seabrook says, but I can prove your logic with electricity. Informal logic is sneakier and more subjective to fallacy, right? No. That's actually wrong. You don't prove logic with electricity. You can make the electricity act according to logic, but the electricity does whatever it wants to do, really. Informal logic is sneaky. Yeah, the succulent reply is a good word. Well said. Informal logic is sneakier, more subject to fallacy, right? The informal logic and the formal logic are pretty close, actually. The formal logic is just capturing as much of the informal logic as it can in formal language. So basically, informal logic is more subject to fallacy, but it's really not that far from the formal logic. The formal logic is just doing as much as it can of the informal logic with formal tools, and then the informal logic runs out ahead of that. So there's limits to actually the level of what actually counts. Logic gates aren't electrical. They can be water. You can make logical gates out of anything. Like you can make logical gates out of marbles. Like there's a game. Like there's a toy where you can basically drop marbles in, and you can set logic gates in like little opening and closing gates. So what do you mean in its premises? The way you set the logic gates up can be electrical, but it can be lots of other stuff. And the electricity is basically one way of representing a logical system. But the formal logic itself is something else. It's a beast unto itself. I mean, it goes back to Aristotle. Yes, the premises are where that's mainly where you win or lose. But the syntax also makes a difference. But that's a completely different story about what you can prove given different logical tools. So, yeah. I mean, you've got quantifiers, you've got lots of weird things, generalized quantifiers, and different concepts of instantiation, different negations, you've got contradictions, so all sorts of things can happen in logic. But yeah. We can have a wider discussion about what logic is and what formal logic is and then what informal logic is. But the idea that the fallacies are in like the informal fallacies and the logical fallacies, they're not always what people think they are. No, that's incorrect. You can represent models of logic as testable and as electrical flow models. So those are particular models of logic. That is not the end all be all. That is one representation of logic. You can do other ones. And so you can test it using the electricity, but that doesn't mean that is the end all be all of logic. So there's different ways to go about this stuff, and there are different equivalent systems, and then there are systems that are not equivalent. And so then you have different logics. Now, there's a question, is there one true logic? Like, one true logic? Like, this is the final logic? That is a different argument, though. But can you model things differently using different systems of logic? Yes, you can. And so then you've got classical logic is what most people think of. But classical logic was basically invented in the late 1800s by Gottlob Frege and Russell, basically. So it's not... It's got some very good marketing calling it classical logic, but that's not the only game in town anymore. So yeah, what you're talking about is basically what we think of as like the standard stuff, but it goes well beyond that nowadays. Yeah, so yeah. Okay, so Jeremy Seabrook, yeah, but you can ask more about logic. I know a good deal about that, actually. Jeremy Seabrook says of the orphan at his school that he was to be avoided for fear of contagion. I realize that I have often worked hard to preempt this to make myself more hygienic. An acquaintance alluded to hearing about my dead parents from a mutual friend, but she told me it wasn't a big deal, he said. I was proud of that one. Superhero identities are dangerous to reveal, but they are not miasmic, creepy, or unbearable. Yes, like classic Coke. It was a real good marketing move to call what we use as classical logic. But I mean, it only took a few years before people started poking holes and saying, you could go a different way. So like there's intuitionist logic, which is a big deal also. The conversation with Megan never materialized, and I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I'd had, or if I had met someone else who had a similar experience. For the simple truth is that I never, to my knowledge, outside of novels and films, met another technical orphan. But I did meet Megan by chance nearly a decade later. Her mother had been gravely ill, but she had survived. She died soon after that first meeting. I'm like you now, said Megan, when we saw each other the next time. Not even technically an orphan, I thought to myself. Orphans are not moral saints. We were sitting on a park bench mid-conversation when a stranger sat down next to us. I decided to continue as if he wasn't there. Perhaps because of my imagination, we had almost been fellow travelers, an emotional missed connection. I told her something I had never told anyone else. The image I've had in my mind since my father died. In a children's book, I had pictures of a space shuttle flying into space. It launched with the aid of 2 vast rocket boosters, external but attached, which fell off back to Earth after a couple of minutes, leaving the shuttle and a large external fuel tank, the orange one if you remember. When the external tank emptied, it too was jettisoned, leaving just the tiny shuttle. Timed perfectly, the shuttle would then propel itself into the Earth's orbit, continue its important work. It had always seemed to me, and so I told Megan and the stranger, if he cared to listen, like a shuttle released from its boosters and a tank. Only something had gone wrong with the timing. In other words, I was off course, released too early, unable to connect with the planned path. The stranger got up from the bench, thanked us without saying what for, and left. Megan left shortly after. I never saw her again. That's an interesting thing. He felt like sort of didn't get the full push of what he was supposed to get from his parents. So it's an interesting look. And this is the end here, I guess we're getting to. Eileen Simpson begins her orphan narrative by saying that she did not look or feel like an orphan, and that she had wrongly thought that her orphanhood had ended when the law said it did. I felt in her very denial a spark of recognition, even though she was much more of a real orphan than I was, younger, orphanage. Maybe more than few of us have had that denial in common, but I'd never have guessed. How many, like me, would find themselves comforted, however awkwardly, by the image of Tolstoy, aged 80, still imagining his mother taking him into her arms. I can't say that a stronger, more supple identity would have ever arisen, or that if I had, it would have stood me in better stead. Only that I noticed its absence, especially set against the overwhelming plenitude of orphan fictions that have flourished in the void. I like the idea that, in writing this piece, I offer another and different account, one that lingers not so much on the details of my orphanhood, but on its shape, set against the shape of the culture that surrounded it. I could have done with an account like that. I had imagined sending this essay out like an invitation, prepared for misfires and corrections, and for malaise that follows, inevitably from the relief of intimacy disclosed. Are we orphans a meaningful we? It might be that, handed the microphone, we wouldn't have much to say. All I knew was that I wanted to ask. That is where I thought I would end. But there is something to add, less comfortable, more ambivalent, without which it would not be honest. Hegel thought that family was a limited freedom because no family, however perfect, survives a lifetime. In orphan stories, family usually prevails. In reality, it dissolves. To the adult, the nuclear family of origin recedes in importance, becoming merely an original basis and point of departure. Often enough, you start a family of your own. I was not prepared for the new dimension of loss that opened up when my child was born. New parenthood introduces a humiliating dependence, which reconfigures many of our relationships to family and friends. For a while, all that matters is who can help and who cannot. In that spirit, a fellow parent likened my parents' situation to hers when it came to their grandchildren. Her parents lived abroad. A free house has become a lack of free child care. I hadn't needed parents for a while. My thoughts were thrown flailing towards them and what they might have offered. Parenthood, for me, was a second grief. Even as the acute demands receded, plenty was left. Watching friends who are parents with their parents, where those relationships were halfway harmonious, it seemed though the arrival of the next generation raises everyone's understanding of themselves and each other by a power. Holding the baby, the parent can say to the grandparent, I was this once, and you were me, then doing this, looking at me this way, and now we all know what we were and what we are, and things can never be the same. This tableau sounds idyllic, and it is hardly universal, but I believe I have seen the dynamic at work. When my parents' eyes fell on me, they knew my mother would not see me grown. I was this, but already they were not me, their paths diverging toward catastrophe. A part of that catastrophe I now see is that we could never know what we were and are. My son has developed the habit, part affection, part attention, part distraction, of asking his parents to hug him together, one on each side. I stand in this brief jovial embrace, reminding myself patiently that this is my nuclear family now, and that from the outside nothing is noticeably missing, and we are just two parents with their kid, and one orphan. Back when I was writing my PhD dissertation, I dwelt on a passage in Nietzsche in which, as I read him, he tracks a progression toward freedom. It begins with doing what you are told. Nietzsche uses the image of a camel. It ends with something truly innocent and free, a child. In between, neither free nor unfree, the spirit becomes a lion roaring, "No, this is no," is the creation of a space for freedom for whatever happens next. The passage came back to me as I began watching The Queen's Gambit. When I saw the mother-killing car crash, when I saw the sullen girl in the loveless orphanage halls, the very same halls I never walked through except when playing Oliver in my childhood imagination, something began to rise up in me. It was the dragon, anger spreading its wings. It was the lion roaring, "No!" I switched it off. I didn't want orphan consultants advising Netflix's next orphan show using their lived experience. I didn't want someone to commission a series of short films told by real orphans featuring orphan actors. I just didn't want to be your story anymore. I still don't. Perhaps there is a breath of this in much talk of identity, the desire at once to be seen and to be left alone. In a sense, this is a story of acceptance, of taking on a label I once rejected, trying it on for size, a baby step toward the freedom afforded by that no. I resolved that the next time I found myself asked about my parents, I would test the waters. When it came, it was, as so often now, a question from a fellow parent prompted by the sight of my child and his exhausted father. "Do your parents help?" "I was orphaned," I said. I half expected to be asked how old I was, and then because I was 17 to be told I wasn't a real orphan. I had my arguments at the ready. It didn't go quite like that. "Fascinating," came the reply. Interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, this is one of these. Well, this at the end actually got very interesting. The idea that you're going to take on a new identity or one that you had rejected or something like that. So, this is basically a story of growth in the end, where the author had one sort of identity, the identity that did not think of himself as the orphan, and then through all these different experiences and reading different things, like like half starts and attempts at or how these things came with Megan, where things did not go as the author thought and continued not to go as the author thought with the kind of label of orphan, and then finally he decides, yeah, sure, I'm an orphan, and then it still didn't go as he thought, but it didn't go as he thought in a sort of in a way that really didn't was not what he was expecting. And this is the thing, he was going in with the childhood, like having his own kid, is that you realize that having the structure of family helps because you have more people to help, of course, but like this sort of idea that in the way you are structuring your family, then you're going to say, oh, I was orphaned. And then it's not so much that you're asking for pity, it's that you have a different family structure. And that's why it went like that. It went fascinating. And so somehow you are doing it without these structures that other people are doing it. So, yeah. I mean, do y'all have any questions about this? It's just, what kind of so we've got two things going on here. We've got this sort of growth in the author, or the change in it, and the rejection of the society that is imposing certain ideas or doesn't really care about the author, but it's using them as a trope. And then the author's actual feeling about it and how they're changing toward the relationship of their orphanhood. So yeah. But yeah, as was noted in the beginning, they did the philosophy thing, but really this was a story about their coming to grips and trying on a version of orphanhood that might work for them. And that, the way it looks like it's going to work for them is in explaining what they mean by family here. Hey Retheus, how you doing? Cinesemiotics had us read a paper on being orphans and what that is sort of entailed by a philosopher. So we're just finishing up now. I hope you're well. So yeah, so what's it called? Where was it? Just looking. So yeah, it's like when he's hugging his kid and his wife or whatever, or husband, I don't know. So his kid likes to be hugged by his parents at the same time. And so it's like this is a very different family structure compared to the other people, because compared to people who have grandparents, and then the author does not. And so he's trying to think of what is that social structure of a family that does not have the typical structure, and why it's sort of not looking like the shape, like the culture does not actually look like that. So it's set against the shape of the culture that's around it. Okay, so what time is it now? It's 10:50. Yeah, that took a bit over an hour. Could read another short paper if people are interested. Go on for a little bit longer. But yeah, this was interesting. So thank you, Cinesemiotics, for suggesting it too.